For over 2 decades, Ceausescu's Romania lived under a harsh dictatorship, where fear was the currency and freedom was crushed. But in the cold winter of 1989, the walls of his regime started to crumble faster than anyone expected. The people's fury exploded in the streets, marking the beginning of a revolution that would change Romania forever. Nicolae Ceausescu rose to power in 1965, positioning himself as a leader who stood independently against Soviet dominance. This independence gained him some international attention and domestic support, as Romanians hoped for reforms and a break from Moscow's heavy-handed influence. However, Ceausescu's leadership soon revealed a darker side. His vision of control went far beyond typical authoritarian rule. In 1971, after state visits to China and North Korea, he became deeply influenced by the cults of personality surrounding Mao Zedong and Kim Il-sung. Inspired by their total control over society and their larger-than-life images, Ceausescu introduced the July Theses, a series of strict guidelines designed to tighten ideological control over Romania. These decrees increased censorship across all forms of media, reinforced nationalist propaganda glorifying Romania's past and socialist future, and pushed a cultural policy demanding that art and literature strictly follow socialist realism, a style that glorified communist ideals and ignored any critical or alternative viewpoints. The cult of personality Ceausescu cultivated was both pervasive and obsessive. He was hailed with grandiose titles like the Genius of the Carpathians and the Danube of Thought, elevating him to almost mythical status. His face was everywhere. Children were taught to idolize him from an early age. His speeches were mandatory listening for everyone, reinforcing his image as a leader above reproach. This glorification extended to the point of absurdity, creating an atmosphere where questioning the regime was almost unthinkable. Under Ceausescu's rule, control wasn't limited to propaganda. It infiltrated every corner of daily life. The secret police, known as Securitate, became one of the most feared institutions in the country. This vast surveillance network monitored citizens constantly. People lived with the fear that even whispered criticism or private conversation could lead to arrest, imprisonment, or worse. Media outlets were tightly censored to ensure only the regime's narrative was broadcast, and foreign books, music, and films were banned to limit outside influences. This created an isolating and oppressive environment that stifled freedom of thought and expression. One of the most controversial and tragic aspects of Ceausescu's social policy was Decree 770, introduced in 1966. This decree banned abortion and severely restricted access to contraception in an attempt to boost Romania's population. The consequences were devastating. Many women resorted to unsafe, illegal abortions, resulting in increased maternal deaths and injuries. This policy showed how Ceausescu's control extended even into the most private aspects of people's lives, treating them as tools for state objectives rather than individuals with rights. Additionally, Ceausescu launched the Systemization Program, a brutal urban planning effort that aimed to modernize Romania by demolishing entire villages and relocating their populations into uniform apartment blocks. This program destroyed centuries-old cultural landmarks and fractured tight-knit rural communities. The human cost was immense, as many were forced into harsh living conditions, uprooted from ancestral homes without regard for their traditions or preferences. In the early 1980s, Romania faced a severe economic crisis. By 1982, the country's foreign debt had ballooned to over $13 billion, prompting Ceausescu to implement drastic austerity measures aimed at repaying these debts. This decision led to widespread shortages and a significant decline in the standard of living for the Romanian people. To achieve his goal, Ceausescu mandated that a large portion of Romania's industrial and agricultural production be exported. This policy resulted in domestic shortages of essential goods, including food, fuel, and medical supplies. By 1983, the standard of living had fallen by 19 to 40%, according to IMF figures. The government's focus on exports led to severe rationing of basic necessities. Electricity and heating were often unavailable, especially during the harsh winters. Hot water was typically restricted to 1 day per week, and unannounced power cuts affected even hospitals, leading to tragic consequences. For instance, in the winter of 1983, dozens of babies in neonatal intensive care units died due to power cuts to the incubators. Food shortages became chronic, and a rationing system for basic foodstuffs like bread, milk, cooking oil, sugar, and meat was implemented in 1981. Ceausescu introduced a rational eating program, claiming that Romanians were consuming too much and needed to reduce their calorie intake by 9 to 15%. This policy further exacerbated malnutrition and public discontent. The healthcare system suffered significant cuts, with expenditures on housing reduced by 37%, healthcare by 17%, and education, culture, and science by 53% between 1980 and 1985. These reductions led to an increase in infant mortality rates and the spread of diseases due to the reuse of medical supplies like hypodermic needles. While the general population endured these hardships, Ceausescu embarked on grandiose construction projects. The most notable was the Palace of the Parliament in Bucharest, one of the largest administrative buildings in the world. Construction began in 1984, and to make space for it, over 10,000 homes were demolished, displacing more than 40,000 people. The building's construction involved forced labor and resulted in numerous worker deaths. Ceausescu's wife, Elena Ceausescu's role was just as dark. Despite lacking formal education beyond primary school, she ascended to prominent positions within the government, including deputy prime minister. Her rise was marked by a combination of political maneuvering and the cultivation of a public image that often belied her actual qualifications. In the 1950s, Elena began working at the National Institute for Chemical Research in Bucharest. She later obtained a bachelor's degree in chemistry through night courses and was awarded a PhD in chemistry. However, the legitimacy of her academic achievements has been widely disputed. Reports suggest that her doctoral dissertation, titled Stereospecific Polymerization of Isoprene, was not her original work, but was instead authored by a group of Romanian chemists under duress. Despite these controversies, Elena was named as a co-inventor on several patents and received numerous honorary awards for scientific achievement during her husband's rule. Elena's influence extended beyond the scientific community into the political sphere. She held multiple high-ranking positions, including chairing the National Council on Science and Technology and the National Council for Science and Education. Her involvement in governance was characterized by a reputation for being domineering and intolerant of dissent. She was known to berate ministers and officials, contributing to a climate of fear within the government. Nepotism was a hallmark of the Ceausescu regime, with Elena playing a central role in promoting family members to influential positions. Over a dozen members of the Ceausescu family held high official roles, often abusing their power for personal gain. By the late 1980s, the winds of change were sweeping across Eastern Europe. Countries that once seemed locked under communist rule were breaking free. In Hungary, barbed wire was removed from the border with Austria, allowing thousands of East Germans to escape to the west. In Poland, the Solidarity movement, led by Lech Wałęsa, had gained power after years of resistance, resulting in semi-free elections in 1989. East Germany saw mass protests through the fall of 1989, which eventually brought down the Berlin Wall on November 9th. But Ceausescu wasn't listening. While leaders in other communist states tried to reform or at least negotiate, he doubled down on control. He continued to praise Stalinist-style rule and publicly condemned the Soviet Union's reforms under Mikhail Gorbachev. In fact, Ceausescu believed Gorbachev was weakening socialism. He saw himself as the last true defender of communism in Europe and refused to accept that change was coming. Meanwhile, tensions were boiling under the surface in Romania. Economic hardship, censorship, and political repression were pushing people to the edge. But open resistance was extremely dangerous due to Securitate. On December 16, 1989, authorities tried to evict Pastor Laszlo Tokes, a Hungarian-speaking cleric, accused of making anti-government statements. Supporters formed a human chain outside his home. By the evening, hundreds more had joined. The crowd grew angrier as word spread. Many of them weren't just there to support Tokes. They were angry about food shortages, lack of heat, and constant fear. They began shouting slogans like freedom and down with Ceausescu. The government's reaction was brutal. On December 17th, Ceausescu ordered troops to fire on the crowds. Tanks rolled into Timișoara, and soldiers opened fire with live bullets. Eyewitnesses later described scenes of people running through the streets, blood on the sidewalks, and armored vehicles crushing civilian cars. At least 66 people were confirmed dead, though many believe the real number was much higher. Some bodies were taken to mass graves or secretly cremated in Bucharest to hide the scale of the massacre. Instead of crushing the movement, this act of violence lit a spark across the country. For the first time in decades, people realized that the regime was no longer invincible. Word of the massacre spread fast, even though the government tried to block the news. In some areas, brave individuals hijacked radio signals or smuggled out footage. Foreign news outlets began reporting on the events and international pressure started building. On December 20th, workers at the big factories in Timișoara joined the protests, shutting down production. They marched through the city, chanting anti-regime slogans. The military presence was still strong, but some soldiers hesitated to shoot. That same day, Timișoara declared itself a free city, no longer under communist rule. This was a bold and dangerous move, but it didn't stop there. By December 21st, demonstrations had broken out in cities like Sibiu, Cluj, Brașov, and eventually the capital, Bucharest. Many of the protesters were young, students, factory workers, and even members of the military. They had grown up knowing only Ceausescu's rule, but now they were pushing back. In schools, teachers joined their students in marching. In factories, entire shifts of workers walked off the job and took to the streets. The country was unraveling from within. Inside the government, confusion was spreading. Some regional leaders started refusing orders to suppress protests. Others fled their posts. The military, long loyal to Ceausescu, began to splinter. Junior officers and enlisted soldiers were witnessing the crackdown firsthand and were uncomfortable firing on their own people. Faced with rising unrest, Ceausescu attempted to project strength. On that same day, on December 21st, Ceausescu reorganized a mass rally in Bucharest's Palace Square, now known as Revolution Square, intending to demonstrate his continued control. Approximately 100,000 people were assembled, many of whom were workers brought in under threat of job loss, and provided with pro-government banners and flags to create an image of widespread support. Ceausescu began his speech by condemning the protests in Timișoara, attributing them to foreign interference and fascist agitators. However, just over a minute into his address, a disturbance in the crowd escalated into widespread booing and jeering. Ceausescu, visibly stunned, attempted to calm the crowd by raising his hand and calling for silence. But the unrest continued. In an effort to regain control, Ceausescu announced minor increases in wages and pensions. But these concessions failed to placate the crowd. The live television broadcast of the event was briefly interrupted, but the images of a confused and faltering leader had already been transmitted across the nation, undermining the perception of his unassailable authority. The rally's future marked a turning point in Romania's revolution. Protests intensified in Bucharest and other cities, and the following day, December 22nd, the military withdrew its support for Ceausescu. Realizing he had lost everything, Ceausescu and his wife fled Bucharest by helicopter. Their pilot, Colonel Vasile Malutan, soon landed in a field near Titu, citing the danger of anti-aircraft fire. From there, the Ceausescus commandeered a car driven by a local doctor, Nicolae Deca, who transported them to Vacaresti. After Deca alerted the authorities, the couple switched vehicles, with Nicolae Petrișor driving them towards Târgoviște. During the journey, they listened to radio broadcasts detailing the revolution's progress, which Ceausescu dismissed as a coup d'etat. Upon reaching an agricultural center near Târgoviște, they were confined in an office and later arrested by soldiers from a local army garrison. Then they were taken to a military base in Târgoviște, where they were held in custody. Colonel Andrei Kamenici, the base commander, received orders to protect them until further instructions. Despite their detention, Ceausescu remained defiant, insisting he was still the legitimate leader of Romania. He demanded meetings with the colonel multiple times a day, often resulting in confrontations. The decision to execute them came at a moment of intense pressure and chaos in Romania. Ion Iliescu and the newly formed National Salvation Front, which took power after Ceausescu's fall, faced an urgent need to stabilize the country and show that justice was being served. They were seen not only as symbols of decades of oppression, corruption, and economic ruin, but also as potential rallying points for loyalist resistance. The leaders felt that a drawn-out legal process would risk giving them time to regain influence or allow unrest to deepen. For these reasons, a rapid military tribunal was established, bypassing many standard legal procedures. This tribunal charged the couple with genocide, abuse of power, undermining the national economy, and attempting to flee with stolen public funds. The trial, held on December 25, 1989, lasted about 1 hour. Throughout, Nicolae refused to acknowledge the tribunal's legitimacy, maintaining that he was still Romania's rightful president, while Elena angrily shouted insults at those present. The execution itself took place immediately after the sentencing at approximately 2:50 p.m. on Christmas Day, within the courtyard of the military base in Târgoviște. Both Ceausescus were led to a wall where a firing squad composed of paratroopers awaited. Accounts describe Elena's refusal to be separated from Nicolae during their final moments. The volley of bullets was swift, ending their lives within seconds. Eyewitnesses recalled how one of the bullets knocked Nicolae's cap off before he collapsed on the ground. Crucially, a cameraman recorded the execution, and parts of this footage were later broadcast on Romanian television. For many citizens, witnessing the end of the Ceausescus on screen was a defining moment. Internationally, the execution shocked observers. While some condemned the speed and nature of the trial and death sentence, others recognized it as a harsh but necessary step to close a brutal chapter in Romanian history. The Ceausescus were buried in unmarked graves within a Budapest cemetery, a secrecy intended to prevent their graves from becoming shrines or rallying points. For years, the exact location remained a subject of speculation. Only in 2010, after persistent demands from their children, were exhumations performed, and DNA testing confirmed the identities of the remains. Despite their deaths, Romania struggled with the unresolved legacies of their regime. Investigations revealed vast amounts of stolen wealth. Estimates suggest the Ceausescus amassed billions in ill-gotten assets hidden in secret bank accounts and properties abroad. The full scale of human suffering also remained difficult to quantify. But historians agree that tens of thousands of Romanians were imprisoned, tortured, or killed during their rule, with some estimates exceeding 60,000 victims. After the executions, Romania faced an incredibly difficult period of transition. The country's economy was devastated, crippled by years of mismanagement and Ceausescu's disastrous policies, which had prioritized debt repayment over citizens' well-being. Factories were often outdated and inefficient, and many were unable to compete in a rapidly changing global market. Agriculture, once the backbone of Romania's economy, had suffered from forced collectivization and neglect, leading to food shortages and widespread poverty. The immediate post-revolution years were marked by instability and uncertainty. The new government was made up largely of former communist officials who had reinvented themselves as reformers. This continuity complicated Romania's path to real change, as many citizens saw these leaders as merely old faces in new roles. The government struggled to dismantle the old systems of control while trying to stabilize the country economically and politically. Inflation soared, unemployment grew, and essential goods remained scarce. Everyday life was a challenge for many Romanians as they tried to adapt to a new system that promised freedom but delivered hardship. Politically, Romania moved slowly towards democracy. The first free elections after the revolution were held in 1990, but they were marred by controversy, protests, and accusations of fraud. The ruling National Salvation Front secured a majority, which frustrated many who wanted deeper reform and a clean break from the past. Over the next few years, opposition parties grew stronger, and civil society began to take root. In 1991, Romania adopted a new constitution that established a multi-party democracy, guaranteeing freedoms of speech, assembly, and press for the first time in decades. This was a crucial step, laying the foundation for Romania's future governance. Despite these advances, the shadow of the Ceausescu era lingered heavily. Older generations in particular carried deep scars from years of repression, censorship, and economic hardship. The fear instilled by the secret police had made people wary of expressing dissent openly. Romania's international standing improved gradually. In 2004, the country joined NATO, signaling its alignment with Western security structures. Then in 2007, Romania joined the European Union, a major milestone that brought investment, development funds, and greater political stability. EU membership also pushed Romania to implement important reforms in the judiciary, human rights, and anti-corruption measures, helping the country move closer to European norms. Even with these successes, Romania's post-communist journey was a complex mix of hope and hardship. The transition from dictatorship to democracy, and from a planned economy to a market system, was neither quick nor easy. The wounds left by Ceausescu's rule shaped Romanian society and politics for decades, influencing everything from economic policies to the way people viewed their government.